Hi everyone, thank you all so much for having me speak here today. I want to give an account of a new form of digital labour that has arisen with the growth of AI, and suggest that our shift to big data is producing a new kind of worker exploitation, one centred on the extraction of our sensorial faculties. My focus today is computer vision, but equally the concerns raised here might also apply to other forms of computational sensory processing, such as speech recognition. In 2019, Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri published a book on how current digital platforms have given rise to a new global underclass. They describe how cheap, piece-rate labour is propping up the coming automation revolution that is set to take place mainly in the global north, a term which I will take today to include the major international megacities, regardless of geography. In a kind of Wizard of Oz scenario, an unmanning of our infrastructural and service-based economies is happening, courtesy of what they call the human in the loop. In the context of computer vision, driverless cars, unstaffed supermarkets, e-health providers, and urban surveillance systems all use cameras and data processing to recognize the world. The true work of this recognition, though, is happening elsewhere, powered by the visual attention of the less privileged. Computers are not by nature visual machines, they are logical or reasoning machines, and teaching them to see requires vast data sets on which to train machine learning algorithms so that they can distinguish between objects, infer their properties, and decide upon their significance. For instance, the 2015-2016 MegaFace training dataset for facial recognition has in its banks 1 million photos of 690,000 individuals, tagged with identification data such as names, places, and dates. Some of these datasets are crowdsourced, that is, harvested from photo sharing websites without the express permission of their owners, thanks largely to Creative Commons licensing. Other datasets are closed and proprietary, and precisely who has gathered the photos and generated the annotations is often obscure, and not a matter of public record, thanks to commercial sensitivities. This demand for data has given rise to a 21st century technological sweatshop in which, ironically, low-paid workers in the global south are doing much of the seeing for the high-tech automated systems deployed in the global north. These sweatshops do not necessarily exploit manual labour in the way that manufacturers like Foxconn do, but they nevertheless extract from these workers repetitive acts of sensorial discrimination. I want to argue, therefore, that the extraction of this labour constitutes a new form of sensorial exploitation, one that has become possible in an economy that intensely monetizes visual attention. What is it like to be a worker in one of these annotation companies that produce datasets? Let me begin by taking you inside a 21st century data farm. In a formerly semi-rural township of Guiyang, in a second-tier city located in the heart of China's southwest, a data annotation company employs undergraduates from the local vocational college, and a workforce of around 500 or so 20-somethings come into air-conditioned open plan offices after class. Tagging photos of streetscapes for autonomous vehicles AI constitutes the bulk of their daily tasks. Between 200 to 300 photos are processed every day, and the photos with densely overlapping objects and 360 panoramas are the most complex to handle. Pay is tied to speed and accuracy, and each person receives roughly an allocation of 40,000 items to annotate per assignment. Every vehicle, person, road sign, traffic light, and potential hazard must be outlined and tagged with the appropriate annotation. If looking at streetscapes seems dull, then looking at presentations of disease means that these workers can be subject to a more brutal sensorial assault. Another site we might visit is located in semi-rural India, in Bhubaneswar, a Tier 2 city on the east coast, where workers review videos of human colons, looking for polyps that could spell the beginnings of cancer. Like their Chinese counterparts, these workers are often young, in their 20s, and have received some tertiary or further education at their local college. Every day, the bulk of their tasks is to look through videos, rewinding and replaying until they find what they're looking for: blood clots, inflammation, and growth. They were trained to spot these symptoms on a week-long teleconference with a California doctor. The company assigns a dozen videos per person in an 8-hour day and counts Amazon and Microsoft among its clients. So what is it about this work that makes it sensorially exploitative? Certainly, the pay and conditions can be far from ideal, but they remain marked improvements upon the back-breaking and often dangerous conditions of manual labour, and the work is not physically strenuous. Rather, the extractive and exhaustive dimension arises out of its unrelenting demand for focus and judgment on the same repetitive task. Assessing whether anything in the photo might make a material difference to road safety or patient health, and applying the right cropping and the right tags taxes the eyes, the brain, and the hands. This repetitive labour engages the senses and brain fully, but it does so in a very prescribed way, where only a very limited subset of things are deemed relevant. The visual gaze is not afforded the exploratory freedom to seek out what is interesting to the viewer, but instead has to be constantly redirected to find the same elements over and over again. When trained in such a way, eye movements themselves become highly rigid and regimented. If the expert seer, the art historian for instance, pays attention to detail for the purposes of interpretation, data annotators do no such open-ended work. The details they notice are always the same elements. Visual data annotation suppresses most of the ordinary functions and sensations of seeing. It is a profound and artificial reduction of seeing into an act of passing. Is this object A one thing, or B another thing? The worker is merely asked to distinguish and recognize one element from another, and what these objects they are looking at might mean is irrelevant. A young worker in the Chinese data farm struggled to tell the difference between car manufacturer logos. Growing up in a rural township, she was far removed from the status symbols that driving a Mercedes or Tesla signals in the world of the wealthy. For them, their work is meaningless and not aspirational. This is what I call sensorial labour. It is a robotic exercise of the senses for the mass production of machine-readable data. The tasks given are both evaluative and repetitious, a combination that means the work cannot simply be performed automatically without deliberate thought. The nature of the work limits and depresses executive decision-making to a low level of complexity, requiring no creativity or innovation, and thus reducing the rate of error and thereby risk. This is a perfectly pernicious combination. The work is robotic, but of a complexity that demands sustained, unrelenting focus. Thus we find in these offices no room for distraction. Small talk is not allowed. Attention or diversion, the normal human sensorial state, is significant liability. There is constant, persistent strain on the human eyes, and a key reason cited for wanting to leave the job is eye strain, and for those dealing with the most horrific scenes, beheadings, sexual violence, mass shootings, the psychological trauma is real. Sensorial rest and intentional autonomy elude these workers. How then might we further contextualize the extraction of sensorial faculties in a digital economy where attention is the new currency? Recent work by Tim Wu and James Williams has established how big tech and consumer-oriented corporations fight to pay for eyes on screens when these eyes lead to revenue generation. Where the act of looking is a cost, however, we see something of the inverse. The calculus seems to be a simple one. It is more expensive to pay for the attention of a doctor or a taxi driver in a major international metropolis than it is to pay for the same attention from a trainee student who lives in a semi-rural city. In India, our annotators earn between $150 and $200 a month. In Mumbai, an MD would command something in the region of $6,000. The workers in the Indian data farm have no medical training. They are not afforded entry into a profession that would enable them to look at the photographs of disease and tell us its history or pathology. They perform instead merely a Boolean sorting. In the data annotation industry, then, there is a great siphoning up of visual attention from where it is cheap, much of it in the global south, and a depositing of it where it is expensive, much of it in the global north. As the economies of China and India grow and labor becomes more expensive, manufacturing companies have given way to a new generation of knowledge firms that have migrated to less developed areas, where, as the IMF notes, reserves of agrarian surplus workers willing to accept lesser wages can still be found. The asymmetries in global capital extraction are now opening up a new frontier of exploitation, where extreme human advancement, automation, is dependent on the existence of limited human advancement, robotic labor. The sensorial labor that they provide is being directly used to replace human sensorial labor in the more expensive cities from which they are increasingly excluded. Computer vision is promising to take the place of low-wage workers in highly capitalized urbs. Bus and taxi drivers, delivery workers, supermarket cashiers, security office and warehouse pickers, and quality assurance checkers. These occupations are high in their demand for visual attentiveness, and were often the entry-level roles that rural migrants could undertake when they moved to the big cities in search of work. So here lies the rub of AI. Automation promises at its core the liberation of humans from repetitive, dangerous, or unpleasant work. Yet the economic disparities powering this technology begs the question, whose freedom does AI serve? Whose quality of life does it enhance? The data annotation industry offers no clear path of upwards mobility, and more insidiously, they appear to be working themselves out of jobs, for once AI becomes proficient enough to deal with real-life data without human guidance, the risk of semi-skilled worker obsolescence is material. In an industry where data is the new oil, these synthetic labeling techniques are already being developed. So this younger generation of workers are trapped in a double bind. They represent a transitional labor force of economies as they cross the Lewis turning point, the threshold of no return where economic development has made cheap labor more scarce. They are caught in the upwards thrust of the promise of socio-economic mobility and the downward pressure of growing competition for opportunities and the rising cost of living. The products that they produce are vast data sets that are the backbone of operations of highly valued companies. The macroeconomics of these sensorially extractive industries are stark. 80% of all time consumed by machine learning projects is data preparation, and the annotation industry is set to be worth $3.5 billion by 2024. Computer vision companies themselves, in turn, are the new unicorns of the tech industry, and Megvii, one of China's largest facial recognition firms, is capitalized at over $4 billion USD. The promise of automation is thus a perverse one. Cheap sensorial labor is tied to a kind of systemic underprivilege encouraged by uneven development, disparities that are set to be magnified by machine learning technologies. Sensorial labor remains an undercapitalized grey-collar job, and our sensorial workers themselves are imprisoned, experientially and economically, by the very technology that flies the flag of human liberation.